Hi there, law and economics students. This will be the first of the online lectures. We're going to finish up the 3 questions that we have at the end of Chapter 5 that we didn't get to before the break. And then we're going to jump to Chapter 8 to deal with contract law, which will take us a while, but not as long as property law, and then we're going to get into torts. What we're typically going to do here is I'm going to go for somewhere between 12 and 15 minutes. It's not easy just staring into a camera and talking without any feedback. I will be posting a series of these and emailing or tweeting you as they go online. With regards to the assignments, you have your paper to work on, which was going to be done outside of class anyway. We've got one more exam that's coming up late in April that we'll do online. You'll get more details about that later on, and I should get to finishing grading this weekend on your first exams, and then I will email you and tell you how you could find out your scores and all of that. Okay, so back to the material. We were dealing with a couple of applications later on in Chapter 5. Just before the break, you may recall we talked about adverse possession, which is really designed to keep land in productive use. So it's a way for a non-owner to effectively obtain ownership. And then we also talked about estray statutes, literally referring to like stray animals, where the issue of property rights for something that is found needs to be evaluated. Is it the original owner? Is it the person who found it, or whatever? So along those lines, I assigned 3 questions on page 155 of the textbook, questions number 20, 21, and 22. So let's go over them rather quickly, and then we'll get on to talking about contracts. Okay, the first question, number 20. Why do you think that the statutory time period for adverse possession tends to be short in states like Oklahoma, where Indians owned a lot of land? There's a very straightforward answer, and the answer is not a good reflection on our history. The white people made the rules, and the white settlers made the rules, and a short time frame favored acquisition of Indian land. So, and it made it more difficult, obviously, for Native Americans to monitor possession, and the goal was to see how quickly the land could be taken over by settlers. Similar to the Homestead Act kind of thing, but this relating specifically to Native American lands. Okay, question number 21. Suppose the statute of limitations for adverse possession is 10 years. So if you've been, let's say, farming land for 10 years, the owner never shows up, 10 years passes, it's your property. Okay. After 9.9 years of trespass, owners still retain full rights, but after 10 years of trespass, lose all of their rights. So you have 100% ownership, and it just falls off the cliff down to 0 at the 10-year mark. Instead of owners losing their rights abruptly at the end of 10 years, the statute could be written so that the rights depreciate gradually over time. For example, the trespasser could be granted a 10% interest in the property for each year of adverse possession, so that after 1 year they would own 10%, and after 10 years they would own all of it. Compare the efficiency of what originally would be called a discontinuous rule, 10 years, 100%, then the discontinuity brings us down to 0, or a continuous rule where over time you're losing more and more of the property. The comparison is pretty simple. Under a continuous rule, monitoring costs are far higher, and therefore it would be more expensive to maintain ownership in that case. Is it good or bad? It is what it is. If you want to see land put to productive use, adverse possession makes sense. On the other hand, should a landowner be told what to do with their property? Presumably, they would use their property in a way to maximize value. So it's just a different set of rules, but continuous ownership rather than a discontinuous ownership rule would definitely be more expensive. Okay. And then finally, the question number 22, which deals with the estray statutes. In other words, if you find something on your property that's not yours, do you have an obligation to try and find the rightful owner? And the answer is yes, but it's not an absolute rule. Question number 22. If the value of a lost object is low enough, the estray statutes do not apply. Consequently, the finder has no legal obligation to advertise. Discuss the costs that need to be balanced to the most efficient lower bound in the value of a lost object for purposes of the estray statutes. Okay, so you have a value here of the lost object going to their original owner, but you also have search costs involved in trying to find the owner. If the item is of low value, it's simply not worth doing that, and finders keepers for sure. If it is something of significant value, let's say you find a wallet that's full of $5,000 or something like that, you do have an obligation to try and find the owner. You find $1 on the street, obviously you just pick it up and it's yours. So it depends upon the circumstances. Obviously, in the day where relating to property law, where all of this mattered, that was really dealing with animals that wandered onto your property. They are valuable for someone else, and you do have an obligation to not take the animal, slaughter the animal for your own use, but try and find whose animal it is. And now we can understand why branding took place, because that's a way of having an identifying marker on the property. Okay. All right, we have spent week after week after week talking about property law. Let's now get into something else. I decided we're going to skip all the way to Chapter 8 rather than getting into torts, because contract law is really similar to property law, because both of those involve voluntary exchanges. And so I've decided that we're going to go a little bit out of order. That's actually how the old edition of the book treated it. Contract law came right after property law. And it makes more sense because we're still dealing with voluntary actions. When we get to torts and then we get to criminal law, those are clearly involuntary actions because one is infringing upon the rights of others in specific ways. Okay. So let's get going. We're in Chapter 8. I've already tweeted you the questions. It's only a few that are really worth your time in the chapter, but we will spend a bit of time, not a tremendous amount of time covering the material. So let's go. Well, contracts are another example of an economic exchange, just like the sale of property. So the question is, why is it any different than the property rights stuff that we've been talking about for so long? Okay, up until now, a voluntary exchange was assumed to be a simultaneous transaction. You obtained property, you gave up something in exchange for that property. It could be property for property, cash for property, whatever the circumstances. And then other than documenting ownership, which is what a title search is all about when you sell a house, you don't have to do anything else. There's no other legal intervention that's generally needed. Okay. But with contracts is something that's very different. And that is the sequential nature of the economic activity that is addressed and contemplated in a contract. It doesn't happen instantaneously. Usually a contract is going to have a time element to it. And because it has a time element to it, you need to monitor the contract. You need to have a means of enforcing the contract because you don't know right off the bat if, in fact, the terms of the contract are going to be honored, all right? So let me give you examples. And by the way, because of this time element, one party, depending upon the particular circumstances, as you'll see, can have the upper hand and be in a position to engage in opportunistic behavior where they take advantage of the other party. Okay, example, I hire you to build a house. If the house is being built and I haven't paid you yet, I have a lot of leverage on ways in which I can influence the building of the house. And I may have a lot of bargaining power because, particularly if it's a custom house, it may be built in a way that it is not particularly valuable to other people. Okay, I'll give you an example. My brother had a boss many, many years ago who built a house, I think, in Bel Air. And it was later in his life, and he built a custom house, and I think it was something over 3,000 square feet. It had one bedroom. Okay. That is not something that a lot of people would value, but he did, and obviously would make it somewhat more difficult to market. Okay. So, in the absence of a legally enforceable contract, I may put a lot of pressure on you to do things for me because you don't have an asset that can be easily transferred to someone else. Now, after the house is built, you have the upper hand because I expect services from that house, a certain quality, and if I find out that the house was poorly built, I will be disappointed and I will have to go after you for shoddy workmanship and all of that. Okay. So clearly the notion of keeping both parties honest in their dealings throughout the duration of this exchange, which is time dependent with most kinds of contracts, is going to be important. Also, what do you do if unforeseen circumstances happen? We're dealing with that right now with the virus, okay? That has affected a lot of contracts, musicians who are touring, construction that's taking place. Well, a lot of construction is still ongoing, but not totally. Other kinds of arrangements, deals that were supposed to be done by a particular point in time. The sale of a house that gets delayed because of the impact on financial markets as a result of all the uncertainty because of the severe economic impact of dealing with the virus. So contracts will not speak to every unforeseen contingency, but it will speak to some of them. Natural disasters, which this would qualify as a natural disaster, maybe a political issue, a strike, for example, that delays the completion of a particular construction project and things like that. Okay. If all the benefits from a contract happen right now, we wouldn't, legal protection is going to be less urgent, but focusing contracts simply on immediate benefits and costs is inefficient in and of itself, because anything where you're looking at a relationship which is better constructed over time, like the services from owning a house received over many years, would not be realized in any sort of long-term projects to build a new plant, to build a nuclear power plant, to build a bridge, things of that nature. We would to build another metro rail line or something like that. We would be biased against that if we're only looking at immediate benefits that can be easily monitored and remedied in the here and now. Okay, so the economic analysis of contracts involves setting up rules that reduce the cost of achieving an agreement. So in other words, we're going to have rules that constrain the behavior of both parties in the contract, but that's going to be for the benefit of the contract and the benefit of the parties who engage in the contract. Maybe that's a better way to put it. So in other words, limiting what we can do could actually make us better off. Okay? And that's what we're going to be exploring with contract law. And as I said, I'm going to be doing 12 to 15 minute chunks of this because I don't want to go batty just staring at myself into the iPhone. So we will continue this with the next lecture coming up.